The alarm had not even finished ringing when Instructor Vesa Kaur grabbed my collar and pulled me to the center of the training floor. Every cadet in the hall turned to watch, and I felt my heart slam against my chest before I even understood why I was standing there. My name is Ethan Miles, and 2 minutes earlier I had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, trying not to be noticed. That plan had failed completely. Vesa Kaur was not human. She stood almost 7 feet tall, with skin the color of dark iron, and 4 narrow eyes that never seemed to blink at the same time. She was one of the Kalith, a species famous across the galaxy for producing the finest combat instructors in known space. Her reputation was terrifying. Cadets who trained under her either became legends or quietly transferred out within a week. "You," she said, her voice low and sharp, "the one who keeps smiling during my lectures. Stand here." I had not realized I was smiling. I stopped immediately. "Human combat," she announced to the room, without looking away from me, "is famous for one thing only: noise. Your species swings its arms and hopes for the best. No structure. No discipline. No art. Just noise dressed up as fighting." A few cadets laughed. I did not. "With respect, Instructor," I said, "some of that noise has ended a lot of very confident opponents." The room went silent. Vesa Kaur's 4 eyes narrowed, all at once this time, which I had learned meant she was either impressed or deciding how to embarrass me in front of everyone. Based on her reputation, I assumed the second one. "Bold words from someone who has never faced real combat training," she said. "Let us test that confidence right now. You and I will spar. Full contact. First submission or knockdown wins." My stomach dropped. Every cadet in that hall had heard stories about her sparring matches. Nobody had lasted more than a few seconds against her in 2 years. "That would not be a fair test, Instructor," she continued, before I could answer. "I have trained in combat for over 200 years. You have trained for what, 2 years? At some small human academy on a quiet little planet? To make this interesting, I will only use one hand. You may use one finger." The room erupted into laughter again, louder this time. Even Grace Sutton, the cadet who usually defended me during these lectures, could not hide her grin. "One finger," Vesa Kaur repeated, clearly enjoying herself. "Let us see what your species' famous noise can do against real technique." I looked down at my right hand, then back up at her towering frame. Something in me went very calm, the way it always did right before something important happened. Fear was still there, but it had moved to the back of the room and sat down quietly. "Which finger, Instructor?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "It might." That earned a flicker of surprise across her face, quickly hidden. "Index finger. Right hand. Nothing else moves, or the match ends immediately in my favor." I nodded and stepped onto the mat. Here is something Vesa Kaur did not know, something that was not written in any combat record she had ever studied. Human martial arts did not survive thousands of years by relying on strength. They survived by understanding leverage, timing, and the exact points where a small amount of pressure could redirect a much larger force. It was never about power. It was about geometry, patience, and knowing precisely where to place a single point of contact. She came at me fast, the way someone who has never lost a match moves, confident and certain, closing the distance to grab my shoulder and end things quickly. I did not block the motion, I guided it. My finger hooked under the first joint of her extended hand and turned sharply against the natural direction of her wrist. It required almost no strength at all. Her own momentum carried her forward, and her balance folded around that single point of contact. Within a second, she was kneeling on the mat, her enormous frame anchored by nothing more than one human finger. The hall fell into complete silence. "Submission, Instructor," I said quietly. "Or I continue." She tapped the mat once, sharp and fast. I released immediately, stepping back the moment her hand touched down. That part mattered as much as the technique itself. Knowing exactly when to stop was its own kind of skill. Vesa Kaur rose slowly, rolling her wrist and studying it as though it belonged to someone else. The room stayed frozen, nobody quite sure what they had just watched. "That was not noise," she said finally. "No, Instructor. That was structure. We simply do not write it on scrolls the way your people do. We write it into the body itself." She studied me for a long moment, her 4 eyes finally settling into stillness. Then she turned to the class. "Everyone, take your seats. We are revising today's lesson." She looked back at me. "Miles, you will stay after. I want to understand exactly where you learned this." I heard Oliver Bennett, another cadet, whisper to his friend, "Did you see that? One finger." I did not turn around, but I allowed myself a small, quiet smile as I followed Vesa Kaur toward the private training room at the back of the hall. The room was smaller than the main hall, with padded floors and a single window overlooking the training yard outside. Vesicor closed the door behind us and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "I have trained thousands of cadets," she said. "I have studied combat systems from over 40 different worlds. I have never been taken down that quickly, by anyone, let alone by a technique using a single finger." "It is called joint manipulation," I said. "My instructors back home spent years studying it. The idea is simple. Every joint in the body has a natural range of motion. If you apply pressure exactly against that range, at exactly the right angle, the size and strength of your opponent stop mattering. It becomes a matter of physics, not power." "Show me again," she said, slowly this time. I stepped closer and extended my hand. "May I?" She hesitated, which surprised me, given everything I had heard about her confidence. Then she extended her arm. I placed one finger beneath the joint of her wrist and applied gentle pressure, guiding her hand through the motion slowly enough for her to feel exactly where the resistance built and where it suddenly gave way. She watched with an intensity that reminded me of a scientist studying a strange new discovery. "Remarkable," she murmured. "It requires almost no force." "None at all, once you understand the angle," I said. "The strength comes from your own body working against itself. I am simply guiding it." She straightened and looked at me with something new in her expression, something that had not been there during her earlier mockery. Respect, perhaps, though I was not entirely sure Caliph instructors allowed themselves that particular emotion easily. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "I judged your species based on old records and old assumptions. I assumed brute force because that is what most young species rely on before they mature. I did not consider that your history might have produced something more refined." "Most people assume the same thing, Instructor. We are not always given credit for patience." "Where did you learn this technique?" "My grandmother," I said. "She taught self-defense classes back home for over 30 years. She always said the real secret was never trying to overpower someone bigger than you. Instead, you make their own size work against them." Vesicor's eyes flickered with interest. "Your grandmother sounds like she would have made an excellent Caliph instructor." "She would have loved hearing that," I said, and meant it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, other cadets moved across the training yard, unaware of the conversation happening inside. Finally, Vesicor gestured toward the mat. "I would like to learn more," she said. "Properly this time, not as an instructor testing a student, but as one fighter learning from another." I felt something shift in the room, a kind of mutual respect neither of us had expected an hour earlier. "I would be glad to teach you, Instructor. Though I have to warn you, my grandmother always said patience is the hardest part to learn." "I have 200 years of patience," she said, almost smiling. "I believe I can manage a few more lessons." Over the following weeks, our sessions became a regular part of my schedule. Word spread quickly through the academy that Vesicor, the instructor who had spent years mocking human combat, was now personally studying it. Cadets who once laughed at me began asking quiet questions after class, curious about techniques they had never considered before. Grace Sutton was the first to approach me directly. "Is it true she asked you to teach her?" she asked one afternoon, catching up with me outside the training hall. "It's true," I said, though I think she still finds it strange that something so simple can be so effective. "Everyone is talking about it. Half the class wants you to teach a session." I hesitated. Standing in front of an entire hall of cadets was very different from a private lesson with one instructor, even one as intimidating as Vesicor. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," I admitted. Grace smiled. "You took down the toughest instructor on this station using one finger. I think you're more ready than you realize." A week later, Vesicor announced that the academy would begin including human joint manipulation techniques as part of the official combat curriculum, taught in part by me under her supervision. Standing in front of that same hall where she had once mocked my species, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me, not as pressure, but as purpose. "Before we begin," Vesicor said to the assembled cadets, "I want to be clear about something. Weeks ago, I stood in this exact spot and dismissed human combat as unrefined. I was wrong. What I witnessed since then has been some of the most precise and disciplined technique I have encountered in 2 centuries of teaching. I expect each of you to approach this lesson with the same respect I now hold for it." The room was quiet, attentive in a way it had never been during her earlier lectures. I stepped forward, feeling steadier than I had expected. "Human combat is not about overwhelming an opponent with strength," I began. "It is about understanding exactly where strength stops mattering. Every joint, every angle, every motion has a natural limit. Learn those limits, and size becomes irrelevant." I demonstrated the same technique I had used on Vesicor weeks earlier. this time on a volunteer cadet, guiding the class through each step slowly and clearly. I watched understanding spread across their faces as the mechanics became clear, the same understanding I had once seen in Vesa Kaur's eyes during our first private lesson. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical cadets were nodding, taking notes, asking careful questions about angles and pressure points. Vesa Kaur stood at the back of the room, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction. Afterward, as the cadets filed out, she approached me. "You did well," she said, "better than well. You taught with patience, exactly as you promised." "I had a good teacher showing me how important that patience is," I said. She tilted her head slightly, her version of a smile. "I believe this is what your species calls a full circle moment." "Something like that," I said. As the last cadets left the hall, Vesa Kaur placed a hand on my shoulder, an unusually warm gesture for someone of her reserved nature. 200 years of teaching," she said, "and you are the first student who ever taught me something new in return. That is not something I will forget." I thought about my grandmother back home, about the quiet self-defense classes she had taught for 30 years, never imagining her lessons would one day reshape combat training on a station light years from Earth. I thought about how a single finger, applied with patience and precision, had changed the way an entire academy thought about strength. "Neither will I, instructor," I said. "Neither will I." Outside the window, the training yard buzzed with activity. Cadets practicing new techniques with focused determination, no longer laughing at the idea of human discipline. Somewhere among them, I noticed Oliver Bennett attempting the same wrist technique on a very patient training partner, missing the angle slightly but improving with each attempt. I smiled and walked out to join them, ready to teach the next lesson, one careful finger at a time.